Welcome to Advent Conversations with Good Samaritan Church in Pinellas Park, Florida. Sue and Martha, thanks for being with us today. We are continuing to talk about some of the women that Matthew mentions in Jesus' lineage. And remember, it's highly unusual for women to be mentioned in lineages at that time. So that gives us just this little clue that there's something significant about these women. And it also clues us in that right at the beginning of the gospel, Matthew means to give us this window into who Jesus is. And we'll do that by mentioning some of these women. Today, we're looking at Rahab. Who is Rahab?
Rahab was a prostitute, and she lived in Jericho, actually between the gates. There were an inside and an outside gate, and people lived there and came in and stayed and probably had beer. Anyway, she was in a position where she could hear people coming in and talking. And she overheard people saying how scared they were of the Israelites because they were coming into the country and killing and slaying and taking over. And these people in Jericho were very, very frightened of this. So she had two visitors come to see her, and she let them know that they could come in without too much trouble because all of her people were scared and they might not fight back. So this led into the Jericho conversation, and the two men, she said to them, "I believe in your God." And they took note of that, and they had some time to get frightened. She hid them on her roof, and then asked them if they would please, when they came to Jericho. These were two spies, and when they went back, they promised her that they would take care of her family when they came back, and she gave them a sign that they would know. This was a red rope hung from her window. When they saw that, they were not to bother that family.
Thank you for that wonderful retelling, Martha.
Yeah. Again, I like, the words or what they mean or whatever. And Rahab means broaden or enlarging. And I think she really enlarged our sense of who's in the family of the people of God. And I noticed the word for that word could be interpreted prostitute or innkeeper. Now in the New Testament, in James and Hebrew, they call her the harlot each time. But I think of Good Sam, prostitute and innkeeper. And the beginning of the Good Sam service is often, Jen, you begin with this or a little bit of both. And I like to think of Rahab as a little bit of both, being an innkeeper, but also a prostitute. And she's on her own, a woman on her own. And we don't know what her relationship is with her family. We know she wants to save them. We don't know how they feel about her. I know I was reading recently, that in India, often if a family is so poor, there's no dowry for the wife. The young woman goes into prostitution just to have money to bring back for her family. And that some people are giving money to the parents, dowry money, so their daughter does not have to go into prostitution. So I wonder too, why she started this. Who knows? Maybe she was going out in some way to help her family then. We just don't know her story. So I like to think somewhat more kindly and think of how often in the Bible, I mean, sort of tick that in James and Hebrew, she's called the harlot, but think of what it's the Bible or the biblical writers or our, or empire or church or whatever has done to so many women, whether it's Mary Magdalene, characterizing so many women as loose, and see Jesus like with the woman accused of prostitution or whatever, cast the first stone. And so I really like Rahab. I think she is so gutsy to have her own business, to listen, being open to listen to these people come by and hear about this God of the Israelites. I grew up in my church youth group. We used to sing, did you? Joshua at the battle of Jericho, Joshua. It's all about Joshua. I'm like, where's Rahab? So I'm so glad for this opportunity to bring her into this, and her bravery and hiding the spies. And I think they respected her so much when she didn't want seemingly money or anything for herself. If you're saying she's a prostitute, I mean, she wanted safety for her family, and the red cord would be the sign that my family is here with me. And they assured her, they trusted her enough. It was a trust for each other. Some people see that that red cord is symbolic of an umbilical cord or a bloodline or whatever that gives birth to a greater sense of the people of God. Salmon, because that's who she married, or supposedly. Is that just the story, Jen? Rather than, I mean, I know he's mentioned in the her husband in Matthew, Salmon. I don't know. I looked it up. It said it's pronounced salmon. I don't know. Well, the story I read, well, it's kind of interesting, salmon anyway, going upstream in order to propagate. But the story that I saw that he, in time, because her family, and she stayed there, grew to see what a good woman she was and how she was so true to her word, and she cared for her family. And this is the time of caring for the family of Israel. That sense of unity was so important that he supposedly married her or whatever. And from them, they had a child, Boaz had a child who continues Jesus's family background.
What I think is remarkable is that given how she is characterized in much of the Gospels and the epistles and all that, it's remarkable that then she's actually picked up and named in Matthew's. He lifts her up in putting her in this lineage, this line of Jesus that he lays out at the beginning of his gospel. To take a woman who was probably, yes, a little bit of both, an innkeeper and a prostitute, and to hold her up as part of that lineage. Wow.
And to me, she's kind of a model for social justice today, as far as, I mean, she lied. She lied about if they'd been there, and lied to her country. She could have been killed for that. She would have been killed for that, but she lied. And it's, if our government orders you to do something that is against your morals, your idea of truth, or what God wants of you, who do you obey? As for me and my house, I will serve the Lord. I thought that, when you think how brave she was every step of the way, and clever.
And I think she probably had not just one battle, but two. One was trying to get in on their plans and earn their favor so she could save her family. But then the second was probably, maybe not, but probably, she had to get her family in the same room, the same household with her. And who knows what their relationship was. So to even convince them to listen to her and to come and be kind of shielded by this safety that she had won from the spies. that would have been hard.
Yeah. Trust is really a big word all through Advent, isn't it? I mean, we think of Elizabeth and Mary and, you know, trust, the dreams, traveling.
Well, why do you think her story makes it into Jesus' lineage? What does Jesus have to do with Rahab?
We learn that she's from Matthew, that she's the mother of Boaz, who marries Ruth, a Moabite, which is a group of people also often, women often thought to be prostitutes because they came from the union of a father and daughter. So he married her because she also was a good woman and very clever and faithful to family. And it just, again, what is the world's view? What is God's view? And God help us to have God's view of others and ourselves. But anyway, Obed eventually, you know, went down to David and et cetera, down the lineage to Jesus.
I think about, you know, toward the end of Jesus' ministry, especially all the names and accusations that will be thrown at Jesus, and you know, people will not like his methods. Will kind of attack him for what he's trying to do, and I think I see in Jesus the same sort of scrappiness and willing to break conventions and do what he needs to fight for the underdog, to care for his people.
When you've done it unto the least of these, you've done it unto me.
Well, and really, if the story is that her family has rejected her and that's why she's a prostitute, and yet she saves them anyway.
Yeah.
Right.
Gosh, how much does that mirror the gospel?
Yeah. And willing to sacrifice her life because she has to trust they're not going to kill her when they come in, or one of the wrong Israelites that doesn't know the story or doesn't see the red cord. What happens to the red cord if it drops? I mean, I don't know. There could, I mean, if I was sleeping that night, I'd have all sorts of what ifs in my mind. Hold on to it all night long. But, and I think when I looked, I hadn't realized before that she was in James and Hebrews. And looking at those, it was interesting. They both call her the harlot, but in James, she's praised for what she did, for her works. And in Hebrews, she's praised for her faith, for trusting in all of this. So to me, she becomes sort of the complete package for a disciple, on having the trust, and then the trust far enough to do something about it.
Each gospel has their own prologue, and she obviously makes it into Matthew's. In John's prologue, he's going to say, you know, this really zoomed out big universe picture, but he's going to say, you know, that the word came to his own basically and was rejected, not received, and then loved and saved the people anyway. And you know, I hear that in Rahab's story, and there seems to be this kind of faint echo of that in Matthew's beginning of his gospel as well. How did her answering the Spirit open the way and the womb of the world for Jesus?
I was thinking back, me growing up in the 1950s, I remember hearing a lot, what will people say? What will the neighbors think? All that kind of stuff. And she certainly opened us up beyond that. Do what you have the power to do.
I think her story, like a lot of the stories that Matthew's going to pull out and name of these women in Jesus' lineage, it really is a story of an unconventional savior, which certainly is what Jesus will be, not meeting expectations of the Messiah, but yet,
not the military man, no.
Yeah, but yet being how God chooses to work in the world. And in some ways, I think Matthew needed to set the stage for that by reminding people of the unconventional saviors in their past. And part of that was these 4 women in lineage.
And I mean, look at the disciples. I mean, that was an interesting crew. as you know, the Sons of Thunder, or they each had their own things going on, and yeah, and then eventually, I mean, Saul, Paul, give me a break. You're picking who had a dream, yeah,
Right.
um,
Right. There's going to have to, if you're going to follow the way of Jesus, this gospel way, you're going to have to be pretty open to and not looking the way you expect it to look. Well, wise theologians remind us that Jesus didn't just come into the world once, but is always coming into our world.
mhm.
Do you sense Rahab or Rahab-like characters still with us, still among us, somehow opening the womb of the world for Jesus again this year?
Well, I think one of the biggies this year was the notorious RGB Bader Ginsburg, as someone never expected, particularly at her time, to have the impact on our country. I mean, one of the few, top of her class, but still no one giving her an offer of a job after law school because she was a woman. We see a woman, now potential, or is vice president. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And Greta, I'm going to Thunberg, I forget her last,
Mm-hmm.
here's a 14-year-old girl, I'm not sure how old she is, speaking at the UN to the world saying, wake up, you guys got to get busy doing what you're supposed to be doing.
Yeah, the Parkland students, I think of so many. I think of the people in Arizona who go out into the desert with water.
Yeah.
Make sure that people who are trying to cross the desert are hydrated. So many of these kind of subversive.
Native Americans at the pipeline.
Yeah.
And I think of you as well. I mean, I was the first woman pastor in Good Sam, and now here you are. And when I was in seminary, I went to a Methodist seminary, Candler. I'd say the top people in my class very often were LGBT, and we all knew, but the Methodist Church couldn't know, or their district superintendent couldn't know. And number of them, well, that's still an issue in the Methodist Church in many ways. And a number of my, are now in England as pastors, because in England, it's fine. But here we are, the United States, this democracy, a little trickier. And I, think you're so amazing. So you are one of the success stories of us opening our hearts and minds to one another.
Thank you.
Correct. I also brought to mind Stacey Abrams, who went out to her people and got them to register to vote.
What a subversive act. Yeah. Wonderful. Yeah. Yeah. I think of, you mentioned me, and yet I feel like coming in at a time when things were open. But I think of people like you and Harold who were there before that. And I remember one conversation with Harold, and they had, sometimes still during his time, they had ordained someone LGBT as an elder. And he had been brought up on charges, and he said, I sat down with the Committee on Ministry and they were questioning me on this. And, they asked him why he had done this. It was typical Harold, but he said, I just looked at them and said, well, do you ever ask someone's sexual orientation when you make them an elder?
Oh, that's a good one.
And he said,
I didn't know he had that too, because we had that when I was pastor. So I didn't realize he did the same thing. Oh.
Yeah. And I just cracked up because, how subversive to, it's how Jesus really to not answer their questions and to respond with your own question that just silenced the room. But that's, these women that we see in Matthew's gospel right there at the beginning, that's the kind of thing they do. They're just subversive, but in this weirdly, deeply ethical way, in a way that just opens the way for justice and love and ultimately, clearly the Christ child to come into the world.
And I love that question because it brings in the humor. I mean, We need to be able to laugh at ourselves. Yeah.
Well, it was a hard time for the congregation when Harold brought up all of this. So
Yeah.
I know my kids were little. We had 30 children in a children's choir.
Mm.
And as soon as the subject came up, all of the parents with children left the church. Not all of them, I stayed, but there were, it was just a grand exodus because they were afraid it would wash off on them and they would become whatever. I don't know. It was sad. It's been hard to get children back into.
Yeah, it takes a pretty long-term visionary, which I think is what, who Rahab was. She could have sold the spies out for a short-term gain, probably. But she had this longer-term vision. And she was willing to kind of live with the costs of that in the short term. But yeah, I've heard from Harold, about that, and gosh, I can't imagine as a pastor, all the flack you would get.
Yeah, he was certainly a visionary.
Well, thank you both so much for this wonderful conversation on Rahab. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you for joining us for Advent Conversations as we continue on the journey of this season.